Thank you. I always feel when I speak to this group like the old Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the others, because I'm not an academic by background. I'm not really even speaking on behalf of Dubbit today. Dubbit is a research and strategy company and a digital studio based in Leeds. I'm their US office and their head of global trends. But I think I'm speaking to you more today as someone who's been in the children's media field for 35 years now, and has occupied something of an unusual position in that field of being at the hub of a wheel, the spokes of which are research, academia, child health, production, distribution, digital, the sort of all the organization, or all the fields that have a stake in children's media, and trying to bring them together to exchange ideas. So I've been something of a synthesizer of ideas, and I hope that's what I can bring you today. I tend to be a tech optimist. I love what children do with media, what media can bring to children. So I'm going to start actually with some stipulations. And I'm glad we've got the screens in the back working, so you don't have to try to read the little text from there. I wanted to start with a couple stipulations that acknowledging some of the problems before I go on to challenge some of the beliefs about children and addiction and media. Overwhelming content is giving kids a paradox of choice. One of the things we are seeing in Dubbit's research is over 60% of children around the world, when we do our trends survey, say that they have often or sometimes trouble finding content they want. And it's not that it's not there. There's lots of content out there. The problem is they're overwhelmed. And there's so much coming at them, a fire hose of media, that they're having trouble finding what it is that they're interested in. Second, screen time. I've rejected the term screen time for quite some time. Screens today are their communication, they are play, they are learning, they are so many different things, from Skyping with grandma all the way through to watching a Nickelodeon show to digging deep into a topic that fascinates you. So time spent is a very poor measure of whether children are for concern about children and media, because it's what they're doing, not just how much time they're doing it. But that said, out of balance media use is problematic, as out of balance anything would be. If a child spent hours and hours a day reading a book, to the exclusion of socializing with other children, to the exclusion of all the other things that you want them to do in life and play, we consider that an issue as well. Risky media practices are also worrisome. We do have to worry a lot about things like bullying online and the social effects of social media, about violating privacy, children's privacy. And then finally, a lot of digital apps and games are designed with persuasive or manipulative techniques. We have to acknowledge that up front. And often, whether they're intended just to try to get your attention or whether they're designed to try to monetize your attention. All that said, we are seeing this rush of images of children that I think are designed to scare parents about how they use media. And I'm just going to run through these very quickly. Digital heroin. Glow kids. You don't often see kids actually use technology in the dark room with that glow, but that's the favorite image. Shorting the internet and game over. I prefer actually to turn to one of my gurus in children's media, Lisa Guernsey, who wrote this book. I'm sad they called the second edition Screen Time. The first edition was Into the Minds of Babes, which I thought was a much better title and didn't use that screen time meme. But Lisa outlines 3 C's of children's media: content, context, and the individual child. And I want to look at the addiction question in those 3 frames for a minute. Content. We take a look at this picture and we see a bunch of kids all focused in on their screens, and we might get worried about, do they actually talk to each other? Are they so focused in on the screen that they're not doing anything? They're not able to socialize? Well, let's look at what they actually were doing. This was a shot of kids playing Pokemon Go together. And we've seen some great research done around Pokemon Go, including a man named Jason Yip at the University of Washington did what I think is the best study of all, that talked about how families, but also how groups of kids were out playing together. And often this was a way to socialize for kids who had difficulty socializing under other situations. Platform bias. I mentioned before if a child spent all their time reading to the exclusion of other things. But if you look at these two images, we've tended often to kind of glorify the child who is so into books that they get under the sheets at night and turn on the flashlight and they can't put the book down. And yet if we look at that image of a child in bed with a tablet, we start to get anxious. Perceived benefit of the platform. We are seeing both in trends around the world of how it's being used, but also in why kids are turning to Fortnite now. A lot of comparisons to the reasons why they used Minecraft before. It's a game that you can dip into or you can dive deep into. It's a game that you can play even at a young age, you can play it very simply, or you can really get very good at it. I did have a colleague who talked about Fortnite being the Hunger Games version of Minecraft, which I thought was a wonderful way of putting it. But we're concerned about Fortnite addiction. We've seen lots of articles in the last few weeks about Fortnite addiction and whether kids are the child who wet herself rather than take bathroom breaks from the game. Whereas the same parents, we were finding when we did a study around kids in Minecraft that parents were saying, I don't want to interrupt their Minecraft session because I can see that they're really doing something creative. So perceived benefit is a big consideration in whether we consider something problematic or not. Looking at context, why is the child screaming when they take away the tablet? Is there a cultural context to this? If you look at some of the places where there's already treatment prevalence for what they consider to be internet addiction, a lot of it is places where they want to exert a good bit of control over children, where, as you see UNICEF saying, the idea of addiction to technology has been used to justify incarceration of children in treatment camps. And looking across the 31-country analysis, can we compare the feelings about use of technology with the political situation, with the cultural situation in the countries that we're talking about? Is there an economic context? We see frequently pathologizing teen behavior as something that is easy to do as a privilege of the wealthy. The headline down at the bottom, Kentucky parents reinvent school for everyone, or is it just their rich kids? A lot of the concern about children and technology began not that long ago, or intensified not that long ago, when you started seeing articles about Steve Jobs didn't let his children use technology at all, and the Silicon Valley families who send their kids to Waldorf schools where there's no technology at all. The quote on the right is somewhat problematic to me because we heard some talk related to this morning, but about the idea of the digital divide. In this case, they've created it as something between parents who restrict screen time or reject screen time and those who are being sold a bill of goods. I think that's a very problematic distinction. I think, but it does highlight that they're talking about it as an economic construct. And then finally, the social context. The chart on the right is something that we've been working with at Dubbit for a while that has to do with what we call fanatomy, and how if you take a story, a character, a brand, and you've got an audience for it that is either very deeply into it but maybe a very narrow audience, or a very broad audience that just kind of touches on it but doesn't really dive deeply into it, you can move that audience along in different ways. You can deepen their relationship with your content by offering them more opportunities to interact with it, or you can try to broaden your audience by using your deepest players, your super fans, to try to bring others into the tent. But I think the reason that I show this is because when we talk about addiction, when we have concerns about the amount of time, the amount of attention spent on media, you have to look across this spectrum about how someone is devoting themselves to or showing their fandom for a certain kind of content. And finally, the individual child. We have known for a very, very long time, going back to the 1960s and Wilbur Schramm, the idea that for some children, under some conditions, in his case some television is harmful, but we can now look at it as some media is harmful. for other children, under other conditions, it may be beneficial. So we can't take a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to this. It depends very much on the individual child, what they need, and what it is that they are doing with media. We can, though, look at parent behavior and see that there's this kind of vicious cycle going on here where parents' own use of media, which is something that we need to consider, is distracting them from the needs of their children. The children act out because the parents are distracted and are not paying attention to them, which causes the parent to sort of retreat further into media, which leads to this cycle that you see here of parental stress levels sending them back to media, which only increases the stress with the child. We have a chicken and egg problem. We started out by talking about the new World Health Organization designation of gaming disorder. These are two quotes from the New York Times article about that. And they show that we have not settled the problem yet of whether the depression or anxiety is an effect of the gaming, or whether children turn to gaming, young people turn to gaming because of depression or anxiety that they are feeling. In the space of one article, they try to have it both ways. So if we're talking about addiction, are we actually doing what we are trying to avoid? Are we exploiting attention in order to curb attention exploitation? Let me show you what I mean by that. There's something of an addiction tautology. If we declare it to be addictive up front, addictive video games may change children's brains in the same way as drugs and alcohol. If we declare it to be addictive up front, if we ask children, do you feel like you're addicted to your device? Then we're leading them to give the answer that we want to get from them. And on the bottom right, the prevalence estimates for what they are calling internet addiction here go from 0 to 26%. So anywhere from nobody to a quarter of all children are suffering from excessive compulsive technology use. When you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is a quote from Nicholas Kardaras. He is about what he's seeing in trying to treat children who he sees as social media addicts or media addicts. Let's not forget the fact that he has a very strong financial incentive in diagnosing addiction in these kids, because he can get $50,000 to $75,000 a month from treating it. Are we really talking about the new normal here? In a Common Sense Media survey, about half and half of parents asked said they felt like their child was addicted to mobile devices. So again, we're leading them with the question, but just under half say they feel they are. And yet at the same time, 50% say they're not very concerned or not at all concerned about it. 31% more say they're somewhat concerned about it. But the concern is not as strong as the implication. Roughly 3/4 of Americans go online daily, and if you look at that chart, it's almost constantly is 26%, 43% is several times a day. I can look around this room and tell you that most of us are online constantly. So are we really when we talk about overuse, are we really talking about the way that we are all using it because of all the things that media brings to us these days? And then this is a slightly older quote on the right, or a set of statistics on the right, but the idea of finding it hard to stay away from the internet for several days at a time. Well, yeah, I mean, I couldn't have gotten here from the airport without the internet at this point. So what we've turned to is Common Sense Media says, well, we use the term colloquially, not diagnostically. And the problem is, I don't think most parents understand the difference between colloquially and diagnostically. I think if you are talking to a group of parents and you talk about internet addiction, they get very scared and they don't understand how you're using it. So what you're doing is you're commanding attention with clickbait by saying children are addicted to technology, which causes parents anxiety. And by using it colloquially, we're giving the press free rein to use it in their headlines as well. So this is really just creating a cycle again of amplifying the problem that Common Sense and others are trying to curb. So if it's not addiction, what is it? Here's one quote from the leader at the Child Mind Institute in the US, who says it doesn't really capture the behavior that we're seeing because it's not an increasing dosage. It's not that you need more and more media to get the satisfaction that you're looking for. You're using it constantly, you're using it for different purposes, but it's not an increasing need. I like this designation. Jenny Radesky, who heads up the Children and Media Committee for the American Academy of Pediatrics, talks about it as functional in terms of functional impairment. That's a very practical term that I think parents can much better understand. If you see media use getting in the way of your family's ability to do what it needs to do, then you recognize that as the problem and you begin to work with the functional impairment. You begin to work with the behaviors that are affecting your family. So where do we go now? Just to close with a couple of things. We can't take the same approach, even if we think about this in terms of addiction, we can't take the same approach that we took to something like cigarettes. Because the answer for cigarettes is don't do it. Stop smoking. That's not practical with media and technology. They are too embedded in everyday life to go about it that way. So what are some of the things that we can do? Google, Apple, Facebook have all introduced managing tools within their apps. So Google's Family, Apple just introduced their screen time apps within the last couple of weeks. And in the middle, you have the Facebook Messenger Kids. They, in full disclosure, I'm on their youth advisory committee, and Dubbett's trends surveys were used as part of the design in designing Messenger Kids. But they added, a couple weeks after they launched the app, they added sleep mode so that parents could say, okay, it's time to turn it off for a while, and the app would go to sleep and tell the child it's time to take a break. My concern about this is they're great to have, certainly want them there. I can tell you, as I said, I've been in this 35 years, when the V-chip was introduced in the US to allow parents to block violent or sexual content or language in the US, over 90% of parents said, absolutely, I want that in every television. That should be mandated for every TV. So they did. 7% of parents actually activated it. So I'm concerned that building in the tools is not enough. This is something I'm just beginning to play with, actually, and I'm actually hoping to do a session on this at the Cinecid conference in October. We look at how young people use certain apps on social media. Instagram is the one that really kind of inspired me to thinking about this, where they're just scrolling through pictures and there's no stopping to really take things in. I'm intrigued by the idea of slow media. Can we design content? Can we design apps that, social settings that encourage reflection, that encourage kids to take time with something, to really take in what they're looking at? That's a creative challenge, not necessarily a legislative or policy one. Classic play. You're focusing on things that have intrinsic motivations for the children to play and that are open-ended, that are not kind of the clickbait, the kind of, Skinnerian apps that we're seeing kids play with, where they're trying to get an external reward for what they're doing. But coming up with ways like the Toca Boca apps, you see their Toca Tea Party here, that are open-ended, that are more like toys than they are like games. Always have to throw in a Fred Rogers quote in every talk that I give. Ethical media design. There are two projects going on right now. There's the Disrupted Childhood out of the UK that just came out. Baroness Phoebe Kidron is speaking at the Children's Media Conference in 2 weeks in Sheffield. We'll be talking about this. But also, about 6 months ago in Finland, there was a Talkut, which is a gathering to work on a project all together around ethical media design for children. You can find their report online. I'm happy to give the URL to anyone who's interested in digging deeper. But they've come up with some very practical, this was a combination of academics and industry people all working together to try to come up with things that were actually doable in the real world to create ethical media design for children. Media literacy, I don't have to go into depth here. This is an audience that knows this very well. But we are not helping kids if we just apply clinical concepts to their behavior as opposed to teaching them effective use of the media that surrounds them. And that's it for me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.